Brandon, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I think the last time I saw you was back in May in Miami at the InfoBip Shift conference, USA. And then I guess, are you heading to InfoBip Shift in Croatia next month?
Yes, I am. Are you?
Awesome. Yes, I will be there. So I guess we'll cross paths again. Fantastic. We could have waited and did this in person.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's introduce you to the audience. Let's start with some basics. Who are you? What do you do? And how do you get to where you are today?
Sure. So I am a CEO and co-founder of Flightcontrol, previously creator of Blitz.js. I'm a software engineer my whole career. I love doing business stuff, creating businesses. Flightcontrol is the first real significant business that I've got into. So that's fun. And outside of work, I like flying airplanes upside down and helicopters right side up.
Yes, you're the only founder and an engineer that I know of that owns their own plane. Although I'm sure that that also flies it. I'm sure Mark Benioff owns a plane, but he probably doesn't fly it himself.
Yeah.
Were you was Flightcontrol a YC company? Is that right?
Yes, it was. We went through Y Combinator winter 22, winter 22, which was January to March of last year, beginning of 22.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about, platform as a service and kind of how that, what that means as people sort of deploying, infrastructure to those various services, and also how it compares to things like, AWS and doing things sort of more DIY. So maybe a good place to start is, what is, platform as a service, and how does it differ than just, using something like AWS services directly?
Sure. So platform as a service is a little bit of a wishy-washy definition, but typically people think of it as Heroku, or Railway, or Render, these sort of full abstractions over top of AWS. That's kind of been the de facto standard for a lot of people, companies starting up, and it's because it's really easy to deploy and stuff. But what happens is, more often than not, it's actually technical debt, and you'll eventually outgrow the platform as a service, either because of cost or limitations around control or scalability or maybe reliability. There's just so many things that can kind of go wrong there. But it was kind of the best of the best of two, the least of two evils, because on the other hand, you have AWS, which is all arguably, the most powerful, the most scalable, the most secure, but it's so low level, and you have to assemble 5 to 15 different low level components together just to deploy a simple web app, right? Yeah. So that's no good either. And so, my co-founder and I both were just didn't like this sort of trade-off, and we were like, why can't you have the good developer experience of a platform, but on my own AWS account, where you can, get that raw power and scalability. And so that's really what we created Flightcontrol to do.
Listen, and do you think things like the movement around infrastructure as code has helped with, the management of AWS directly?
Oh, absolutely. Infrastructure as code is just almost critical, because before infrastructure as code, what you would do is you would, have ClickOps. You would go hunt and peck around the AWS console, change some settings or whatever. But then what happens if you need to recreate that environment in a different region or whatever? How do you have no idea what settings you've changed and how to save them. And so infrastructure as code gives you a concrete definition in your code base of what the infrastructure should be. And so it allows you to easily reproduce it. But the problem is things like Terraform and CDK are very low level also. And so you just have to know a lot of things. And so what we've done is created a higher level abstraction, which we typically refer to as flightcontrol.json. And so it's designed for developers. So our whole kind of philosophy here is making developer first infrastructure. So giving the power of AWS to developers in an easy, flexible package.
Listen, yeah. And so, you mentioned Heroku, and, I want to, go a little bit deeper on that. So I can remember when Heroku kind of launched back in, it was late 2000s. I think 2007 is the founding of Heroku. And it was a magical experience, to be able to go and basically just git push deploy I think it was really one of the first cloud native development environments that existed. And in comparison to essentially going and like spinning up EC2 instances on AWS and managing your deployment through Jenkins or something like that, and dealing with all those raw components on AWS, it was this like magical experience. And I think you mentioned that when you're using things like platforms as a service, like people, as those companies scale or as the infrastructure scales, they run into different challenges around just like, it's basically technical debt. And there's also cost issue with that. From your perspective, what were some of the challenges with like Heroku? I mean, they ended up selling to Salesforce. I feel like, they've grown that business, but it's not really in the zeitgeist of like the magical experience that it was 15 years ago. Like no one's really talking about, oh, like, did you see the latest thing that came out from Heroku right now versus like 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think they've sort of failed to invest in keeping up to date. Like it doesn't support HTTP2 and just like some of these basic stuff, so it's sort of degraded a lot on that respect and reliability. They've had security issues. So it is definitely is kind of sad. It's definitely such an iconic service. But that said, even as great as it was, a lot of companies like, for example, Instacart started there, but then they outgrow it. And in some cases, that can be a very expensive and time-consuming migration into, depending on how invested they were there. And so we're trying to prevent that. We're trying to have a platform that is really easy for startups. It's just as easy as Heroku or whatever. You don't have to be an AWS expert, but then it will theoretically scale with you forever because it's using your own dedicated infrastructure on AWS. You have the access and control if you need to customize or tweak stuff.
And what about from like a security perspective? So, I mean, I think like the advantage of like the sort of traditional platform as service, if they do security right, then it's kind of just like, like it's out of sight, out of mind in some capacity. And then if you're doing AWS correctly, you can have a very secure environment, but you can also have a S3 bucket that's wide open to the public. I think they only recently made it not the default setting. And then I guess like how do these things compare and then also compare to what you're doing at Flightcontrol?
Yeah, so I think there's, with Heroku, they have a custom layer of infrastructure between you and AWS. And so there's more software, there's more opportunity for issues. But generally they're good at it. On AWS, the nice thing is that we automate all of that. So we give you the best-in-class setup that's already secure, that has everything you need. Of course, you could go in and mess something up yourself. But we're trying to provide education around that and just adding more and more features so that, like, for example, making it easy to give the rest of your team access to your AWS account. Like that's something that we can add to make it easier. But generally, you kind of get a more secure setup by default because it's your own private account. We deploy stuff to a VPC, virtual private sort of network. And there's a lot of companies like that have compliance concerns for around like government, healthcare, and whatever, and they need that. And so if you use something like a database on AWS and your backend is deployed to Vercel, then you're actually connecting to that database over the open network, and you're sort of relying on those database credentials to keep you secure. But if you deploy everything within your AWS VPC, then that database can be private to the public. And so that you can't even access it to try to like brute force your way into it. And so that's a big benefit.
Yeah, and I imagine for any regulated industry or a company that's like on a certain scale that has a lot of customer information that they need to protect, that's going to be an absolute like P0 priority for them versus just essentially relying on the database credentials to keep things secure. So in terms of the like deployment models. So with things like Heroku, Vercel, like it's very simple to do. Basically, you can connect it to your Git account or there's other means as well. But essentially, you push to a branch, it's just going to auto deploy it. Everything's kind of taken care of you from a CI/CD standpoint. You can roll those things back. AWS, you're probably going to have to build and develop your own CI/CD pipeline using a tool. How does that compare to what you can do with Flightcontrol?
So we support both. We will automate all the CI/CD for you, have you, the Git push deployments by default. We have preview environments for branches. So if you create a branch, we have full stack preview environments. So not just the front end, but also your back end, your database, your Redis, your private workers, all of that can be spun up as a temporary environment. And so, but for customers who want more power features, like if they want to control the build for some reason, and they can point us to their image registry. And so they would run the build, create the Docker image, upload it to the registry, and then just send us a deploy hook, deploy trigger, and we'll just deploy that latest image for them.
And then maybe we can walk through like what is sort of the process to getting started with Flightcontrol. Like I understand with some of these platforms as a service I've used, like things like Vercel, Heroku, and so forth in the past, like the startup process is pretty simple. Like, and that's really like the attractive part is like if I'm a 1 or 2 person company that's just starting, I don't even have to think about that stuff. I can go like focus on actually like trying to get customers or build something that's going to be useful.
Yes.
Like what is sort of that ramp up period and what is the process to get started with Flightcontrol?
It's exactly the same as you're used to with Heroku or Vercel. Connect your GitHub account, define a few simple settings like your build command, start command. For the most part, it'll be automatically detected. And then connect your AWS account, and it's just off to the races. It does take a little bit more time to get the initial infrastructure created, like 20, 25 minutes, just because you're provisioning from scratch stuff in AWS versus like a platform as a service. Traditional is shared infrastructure, and so they don't have to, they can have like servers warmed up, ready just to swap in, for example. So the initial setup is just a little bit longer with Flightcontrol, but then that pays off over time because of the power and flexibility you get.
And then, what are some of the challenges that this approach solves versus using the sort of, platform as a service? Like, I think it sounds like you're sort of matching the platform as a service from like a developer tools standpoint in terms of ease of use, but what are some of the challenges or limitations that traditional platforms as a service providers have that like Flightcontrol is essentially, addressing?
So the platforms as a service, they typically are marking up AWS cost, which we don't. They have more reliability issues, typically because of this extra software layer that they have between you and AWS. Typically, they have more limited regions, whereas AWS has like many regions. I think almost 30 regions, and most of the platforms only give you a certain subset of that. Sometimes only like a 1 or 2. And then if you need to, customize some of the CDN settings or like some sort of the load balancer stuff or the auto scaling rules, like you're limited to what they give you. And so in Flightcontrol's case, like if we don't support it, if we haven't built it yet, you still have it. It's in your account. You can go in there and customize something. Even if we haven't like made it easy, it's still possible.
What are some of the like initial customizations that infrastructure teams typically need to like address as they, like if they were using something like, Heroku, they're going to hit essentially some limitation in the platform at some point. What is sort of that first limitation that they're hitting that, they would want to be able to customize?
I think depending on their level of traffic, auto scaling is probably one of them. I know a lot of Heroku customers end up using a third-party auto scaler connected to their account just because Heroku doesn't support what they need. And so, that's something you have direct access with AWS. You can define based on CPU or memory or like requests per second, sort of whatever makes sense for your setup. I think the other thing is often just cost, especially Heroku. The others are a little bit more reasonable, most of them, but Heroku is kind of crazy on the costs.
And then like, in terms of the challenges that, developers face when sort of DIY with AWS. So essentially they're like, I'm not going to rely on Heroku. I'm not going to rely on Flightcontrol. I'm going to do this myself. What are some of the big like initial challenges that they come into? Is it mostly just the sheer like complexity of like essentially combining these 15 different services together to do something fairly simple like launch a web application?
Yeah, pretty much. Like, so if you've never done it before, like you are in for a world of headache, and it just takes a long time to figure it out and like get it working. It's just tons of iteration. Like you're literally will probably spend weeks, if not months, if you haven't done it before. If you have done it before, um, then you're kind of inclined to like, oh, I can save some money. I can just roll it from scratch myself. But don't have to worry about a third party service. And typically that'll work for companies in their early stages. But as they bring, what we typically see is as they bring more and more engineers on, eventually like the person who set that up is like doing something else, or they're too busy, they can't manage it, and now like kind of has to be more of a shared team, or someone else has to level up, and so it just becomes a lot more maintenance burden overhead to maintain that and to set it up for new and more services. And so that we find that companies who started doing it themselves, when they get to around the Series B stage, when they're really starting to scale the team, that's when they're like, okay, this is not working anymore. Like, we need a better developer experience. We need developers to have easier access to spin up new services, easier access for them to debug and monitor what's going on. Yep, for sure. We find that often people will just be testing prototype stuff on a platform as a service, but when they're ready to go production, they're like, I want to use AWS because they know about the power and the scalability and the reliability of it. But they want something. They want that same experience. They want it to be easier.
Yeah. And how does this work for like multiple regions? Like if I need to essentially be running infrastructure in Europe, maybe for compliance reasons with GDPR, and I also have infrastructure running in the US. How do I manage those two regions? Or like how does it Flightcontrol like ease the management of those two different regions?
So multi-region is a very complex and tough subject. So what we support today, if you need to fully isolate your European infrastructure, then you would have two different environments. You would have like a European environment and an environment for everyone else, or the US or whatever. And so each of those could have their own database deployed there. They'd have their own specific URLs. So that's a relatively straightforward. But if you want to have a single database that is multi-region and your app is running multiple regions with like all the same data, that becomes much more difficult. It's easy to deploy the infrastructure multiple places, but managing the data and keeping the data in all the places and up to sync is much more challenging. Hopefully we can build stuff in the future that makes it easier for the larger companies that need that.
Yeah. So, we talked about like sort of the getting started process, like the deployment model sounds like it's relatively similar to using like an existing platform as a service, except I'm just essentially it's going to spin up resources within my own AWS account. But what about as I need to do certain like customizations and configurations? Like what am I essentially interacting with at the Flightcontrol level in order to make sure that I'm using RDS versus some sort of other like DynamoDB or, basically how do I make these choices that are AWS specific and to customize it? And like, how does that work with Flightcontrol?
So we have 5 main service types. And so you would come into Flightcontrol and you can add a server, a background worker, a RDS database, a Redis instance, or a static site. So those are the 5 things that we support, which covers the vast majority of cases. We'll be adding more over time, including serverless functions. But so that's the kind of the level that you think of like, okay, I need a server, I need a database. And then inside of that, then we have, the most common configuration that you're going to need, the instance size, how many instances, how much do you want to, your auto scaling rules, your custom domain. And sometimes we expose a bit more custom stuff, like you can add a Datadog sidecar to your server if you're doing like a lot of monitoring and observability stuff. So we started very simple, kind of give you good defaults, and then slowly kind of expose more and more configuration to you as you need it. And then, of course, the ultimate is you go into AWS and you have unlimited access directly.
Yeah, and then if I go into AWS, I need to do these, customizations. Like essentially, how do is that tied or back to what I'm doing at the flight control level? Like, how are those two worlds connected? If I do those customizations, how do I make sure that essentially I can have that like reproducibility for changes that happen down the road?
Good question. So, depending on what you change, it may not be reproducible, but it will stay. So, we don't overwrite every configuration on every deploy. We just surgically update whatever needs to be updated. But we're looking at various ways to either basically ultimately expose every possible configuration through flight control, or track the changes that you make in your account, and then sort of have like a log of that we can save so that you can reproduce.
And in terms of the actual engineering of flight control itself, like what are you? I'm assuming you're running on AWS since you're essentially serving the AWS world. But like, what was the engineering process for building this? Like, what is it actually built in? What sort of details can you share around the actual platform that you built?
Sure. So it's all full stack TypeScript. It's Next.js front end, Next.js and Blitz.js front end. We're actually rebuilding the entire dashboard right now using the new Next.js app directory and server components. That's sort of a whole other discussion. But the most interesting part is the backend, which uses Temporal. Temporal.io, I believe it is. And it's a workflow orchestration engine that was created at Uber. And it's super powerful. It's definitely helped us build a much more robust system without it. It's basically an abstraction over queues and cron jobs. And so it's kind of like, you can think about the jQuery days of building UI where it's just you're imperatively kind of doing stuff all over. That's kind of like queues and cron jobs. But Temporal is kind of like React, where you kind of just define what you want, and then it sort of handles the retries and reliability and stuff like that for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what are you using Temporal for? Like, what is that helping you use?
So that manages all the backend, all the deployments. It takes in, the webhooks from GitHub and processes those, triggers deployments, manages environments, all of those sort of things, manages the builds.
And then as a customer of Flight Control, am I running an instance of Flight Control within my own AWS, or is it more of like a SaaS service essentially that's connected to my AWS account and then manages AWS on my behalf?
It's a SaaS service that's just connected to your AWS. So like the GitHub webhooks would come to our infrastructure, but then we issue commands to your account to run the build, to run the deployments. And so all your infrastructure and all your environment variables, secrets, et cetera, are in your account. And so none of your users' traffic touches our stuff.
And then, the company's been around now for you said 2022 was the YC bash that you went through. So
we really started building about 2 years ago.
Okay. And then what was sort of the decision-making process? Like what led you to essentially doing, full stack TypeScript? Like how did you make these different engineering choices? And have you regretted or had to backtrack on any initial choices that you made?
So choosing the same language, full stack, just has so many benefits, making it easier to move between different parts of the stack, makes it easier to be a full stack engineer. It's also what I really had a lot of experience in. My co-founder Mina is CTO, he manages the engineering side much more than I do. He had less experience with it, but still is fully gung-ho on typed languages and the benefits that brings you. I think Temporal has worked out really well. React and TypeScript, I think that all has worked out really well. I'm trying to think if there's anything that we've sort of regretted. I think if anything, maybe just some architectural stuff, internally. But I think even most of that we, got mostly right. And it's impossible to get it perfect the first time. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're probably doing something wrong. You're probably moving too late if you're essentially, getting perfection from the beginning. You're just not moving fast enough, especially as a young startup. You're going to spend 4 years just whiteboarding things and getting the perfect architecture, and even then, it's probably not going to work. And then I guess when in terms of like the services that you're running on, like is this deploy like what is the like are you using like Kubernetes? Like what kind of like infrastructure do you have set up to actually run flight control? Are you using flight control to run flight control?
We are using flight control to run flight control.
Yep.
So you mentioned Kubernetes. Our service types are built on AWS Fargate. So it's a similar thing to Kubernetes. It's a container orchestration engine, but it's native AWS service. The Kubernetes is great, but it has a minimum cost of like $200 to $300 per month, and it requires more sort of expertise and knowledge of it to use it. And so we really like AWS Fargate because starting price is $11 per month. So it's very, very affordable for companies to start with. And it's relatively hands-off while still giving you a lot of the controls that you get with Kubernetes.
And then you basically started this company during, like the era of the pandemic. So I guess like what was some of the challenges that you ran into? Just like I'm assuming you're like a mostly remote team. I believe your co-founder is based in Toronto. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So you're in the United States. He's in Toronto. Your team is all over the place. Is that right?
Yep.
So what were some of the like? How did you kind of think through that process of like running a fully remote company? Like, have you been through that experience before, or was this something new?
I mean, it was never even really a question about whether I would go remote or not. Like it was definitely remote because that's what I wanted as an employee. And I'd been working as a contractor, remote. And so like, that's what I wanted. I'm building a company that I would actually want to work for. Like that's ultimately my success for me, is having a company that I love working at and that I would actually want to be an employee at too. So, my co-founder and I met online. We actually didn't meet in person until about 6 months after we incorporated officially. It was just all kind of funny, but it's worked out really well. And so we do try to get the team together in person like 2 to 4 times per year. Ideally 2 like week-long retreats, and then a couple other sort of informal, maybe at a conference or something like that. So we're actually going to Quebec City next week for a week. So that'll be awesome. The time before was Thailand, and the time before that was Italy.
Nice. That's it. Maybe I need to jump on the flight control bandwagon. This sounds pretty great. But do you have to think about hiring differently when you're essentially establishing a fully remote company, or like essentially the I don't know, the traits of an individual that's successful in that environment different than the traits of an individual that maybe is more successful in a place where they're going into like a place of business on a daily basis?
There may be some subtle things there, but it's not something I think about when hiring someone. Like I can't think of anyone that I've been like, oh, they would be good in office but not remote, or vice versa. I think the main things that we look for is just a really high standard of excellence in every part of their life. I think it's evident. Like excellent people are just kind of excellent at everything they do. They kind of operate at a high level. And even if it's not about the skills today, it's really about the level that you think about stuff, your capacity, your curiosity, your hunger to learn, how fast do you learn, how are you thinking about the broader picture, how things to fit together, the effects that something may have down the road. But the big benefit of remote is that your pool of options is global, or nearly global.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you're not limited by the talent pool that's like within, I don't know, 50 miles of your office space, essentially.
Yeah. I really wish I could be in the office with my team. Like, I think you would actually be more productive, or actually like more effective maybe. But I couldn't have the team that I have in an office here in Dayton, Ohio. Like, I'm not going to move here, And so, all things considered, I think it's much better being remote. Hopefully at some point we'll be large enough where we can have offices in major cities where people can come to, that live around there if they want to, like an optional sort of hybrid thing. But I think we'll be primarily remote for the long haul.
And what's the team structure today?
I'm CEO, co-founder, CTO. We have 4 engineers, 3 full-time. Wait, let me think of this up. 2 full-time and a contractor and an intern. So there's 4 reporting to Mina. And then we have 1 developer relations, senior DevRel that's reporting to me. And so most of the team's on engineering right now, and then I'm doing all the sales and marketing, the go-to-market stuff. So that's been a learning curve for sure, coming out of engineering and trying to learn sales and marketing and growth.
Yeah, I've been there myself. That's basically how I learned sales and marketing by being a founder, because I had to, because there's nobody else to do it, basically, especially in the early days. And then what about, who was that like first hire when you came out of the YC batch? Was it essentially scaling the engineering team?
So we actually, the very first hire we made was someone to help maintain Blitz.js. And this was before we even started YC. It was just after we got our initial funding from angel investors. And that's because I'd been spending most of my time on Blitz.js at that point. And so we needed someone else to kind of take that over and maintain that so I could focus on flight control. So that worked out really well. And so Mina and I were just working together in flight control. And then we hired, it was right after YC that we brought on my brother as a junior engineer to sort of help with the engineering stuff. And then hired a couple more, or at least another one a few months after that. So it's been slow hiring. Like you want to make sure that you don't hire too fast, because more people doesn't necessarily make you move faster. So it adds a lot of overhead and also expenses, cuts down your runway. So trying to grow as slowly as we can, but also make sure that we don't, like cripple ourselves by not having enough help.
Yes, yeah. And you mentioned Blitz.js, so that's a open source front end JavaScript framework, right? That you started.
The idea was to create a Ruby on Rails style developer experience for JavaScript and React. It sort of had a lot of the same sort of qualities, but never really reached that dream state. And so it kind of just stayed as more like a toolkit to help you build full stack apps faster with Next.js. And it got over 12,000 stars, has thousands of people around the world using it. Downloads is like still growing slowly. And so that was really fun. That's how I learned that I have a good knack for developer experience. I really enjoy building developer tools, marketing to developers. And that was kind of it really set me up to be successful here with Flight Control because of that. And it also gave me a good network in initial awareness. It's how we got a lot of our first Flight Control customers.
Yeah. So how important, I guess, has that essentially contributing to that open source project and establishing it been to your go-to-market? It sounds like it was instrumental in landing some of those first customers. Is that sort of a key part of your go-to-market today?
It's not a key part of our go-to-market looking forward, but it has definitely been I don't think we'd be where we are today without it, because it's just given so much awareness to us, to Flight Control.
Right.
It's given a lot of credibility because a lot of people know about Blitz and they like the idea, even if they've never used it. And so we kind of got more mileage out of it than just because of the idea of it. People are like, oh, they like that. So yeah, we still get, traffic coming in from Flight Control for that, but I think it'll be relatively smaller and smaller as we expand in other areas.
And you do a lot of, I know you do a lot of public speaking. I guess how critical has that been to growing this business, and what is sort of the motivation around that, and how do you, I guess, tie that to KPIs for the company?
That's a good question. It's we're still kind of figuring out now what works, what's worth, investing money and time in for growing Flight Control. And it feels like we haven't got a lot of value from either speaking at conferences or sponsoring them. We haven't done a booth yet, but we've done some of the smaller sort of sponsorships like badges or something. But it's hard to if you're too focused on direct, like new customers from something, it's tricky because with a product like this, it's not just every day you switch hosting providers or deployment tools.
Yeah.
So you have to be top of mind when an individual comes across that problem that they either need to deploy a new service or they need to improve the systems that they have. And so part of it is just awareness and just being top of mind and reminding them, even if I'm just showing up at a conference and wearing my t-shirt, like I can see like kind of recognition, like, oh yeah, the flight control. And then, and so that that helps build your brand to like a public conversation more. But it's really quite a long-term game.
Yeah, I mean, I think from where you're sort of establishing like a new sort of like type of like deployment system essentially, or like management of infrastructure system, then you have a big awareness challenge, and then that plays into essentially the timing, because not everybody's ready to switch infrastructure. Or like you mentioned someone might start out on Heroku or Vercel or one of the other platform providers, and then they hit Series B and they're like, oh, well, we need to like re-platform at this point, or we need to think about like making the switch. So it's like, are they aware that you're in available resource for at that time?
Yep. So you gotta have the awareness. Next is like familiarity, that they actually understand what you do and like your strengths, and being able to picture like how they would be able to use your product and how it would benefit them. And lastly, I think is trust. Like, do they trust that you're reliable, that you're going to be around? And so all those things are things that we're working on.
And then when you talk to engineers about what you're doing, is this something that they immediately see the value of, or is there essentially like like sort of pre-existing like challenges that you see over and over again that you have to overcome?
I think people see the value, the idea quite quickly. They're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I think the next stage of like kind of moving them from thinking about using something like Vercel or Render Railway as a default, that's a little bit more challenging, because AWS is a little bit more of a like, oh, it has a stigma, and like, oh, like maybe worrying about like, are my costs going to balloon or something. And so there's a little bit of like mental barriers there that we kind of have to like work on with messaging and stuff. But for the most part, people who are doing something serious, like running a real business or whatever, they understand the value of AWS. And so that becomes easier. It's more like the hobbyist side projects, where it's like it's hard to get them, but we don't actually care about them that much, because they're not going to be paying us much money. Like we're free for individuals, so we like them. It's a good way to get awareness, and we want to make it a good experience for them. But ultimately, they don't fuel the business.
And what's some of the switching costs for somebody who is migrating either from an existing platform, or maybe they were managing AWS themselves today, but they want to have essentially like lower their sort of internal like resource costs to do that?
It's usually pretty simple. Like, as far as changing the application, it's just deploy it and switch to DNS records. Like, that's really all there is to it. Migrating a database is definitely more involved. And we have some guides and are working on guides on that, especially like for people migrating from Heroku, for example. But it's also something that we help customers with. So we like provide a lot of hands-on support for people who want to help migrating, or if they run into any weird AWS thing as they're using Flightcontrol, we're there to help them. But even migrating a database is not that difficult. You basically put your app into a maintenance mode, or like kind of freeze it somehow, and then dump the database, upload it to the new database, and connect your application, switch it to connect to the new database, and then you're up and running. So it usually doesn't take that long, and you can do it during not off-peak time.
What would you say is like one of the biggest like engineering challenges that you've faced over the last couple of years as you're building this platform?
This would be a better question for Mina, since he's in that day to day much more than I am. I mean, AWS itself is just crazy. The figuring out the APIs, and like each one is like a little bit different, has its own quirks. So that
they're even a little different across regions as well.
Yeah. It took some time for Mina to like really kind of ramp up with, but now I think he's pretty much, he like thinks like AWS and he can figure it out. But like what he says, it's like some of these services and the APIs, it feels like they got a team together in a room and they're like, how can we make this the most complicated, the most confusing API possible?
Yeah. Yeah, probably just the maybe speed to go to market to get something out there. Yeah. The in terms of like, you mentioned this hurdle around just like kind of like getting a handle on the APIs and all the variability, and as I mentioned, they can even vary in terms of what services are available across different regions, and sometimes they work a little bit different depending on the region. What about just like, how do you sort of stay on top of the sheer number of services that are coming out from AWS at any given time, and like how do you prioritize your support for those different services?
Well, frankly, half the stuff or more that they release is just junk. Huh.
I
You
mean,
don't
they
have
have
to
like
worry about it.
5 different NoSQL databases available. Like, like how does anybody possibly navigate that?
Yeah, like they so much of the old basic stuff, S3, EC2, load balancers, ECS, all of these are like really, really good and reliable. They don't change, and so it can be challenging to figure it out and figure out the APIs. But the nice thing is that once you've got it figured out, it's extremely stable and reliable. They hardly ever change stuff or deprecate stuff. Um, you know, we're still just building out support for all the basic, the most commonly used, let alone like the new shiny stuff. And frankly, most people just don't need all that stuff. There's going to be the some that are more sophisticated that will do it, but over time we'll hopefully support more and more.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get a little bit sort of in love with the idea of these like complicated infrastructures. It's the same thing in data engineering. You see like this modern data stack that has like 25 different services, but most people starting out their sort of data pipeline, they need like a spreadsheet. So, or maybe they need like Redshift, or like, like they need simple warehousing, simple reporting, and they don't need 30 components to do that. It's just like it becomes like an over engineering problem for different companies.
Yeah, unfortunately, engineers like to engineer, and sometimes at the detriment of the business.
Yes. So, what's next for Flight Control? Is there anything exciting that you can share in terms of on the development front?
Yeah, so we're getting ready to roll out an entirely new marketing website. It has a whole new sort of branding, look and feel, to accompany a new logo that we rolled out earlier this year, and we have an entirely new dashboard that's built from the ground up with using Next.js and server components, all new design, all new UI UX. We've been working with Overnice, a design agency out of Berlin. They did the branding and design for Prisma in the early days. And they've been absolutely incredible, put together a really awesome brand. And so this new dashboard it's just gonna function so much better. It has a ton of new features like live AWS cost in the UI. So you can see exactly how much each service is costing you. We have CPU and memory charts, runtime logs, and so there's a bunch of new functionality in there. And this should be rolling out within a month. Hopefully, we'll have it ready for early access for our current users by the end of August. But that's really exciting. And then after that, we're going to be working on a blazing fast build service that should get a lot of builds under 1 minute.
And the dashboard that you mentioned, that's essentially a easier way to monitor not only cost, but essentially what's going on AWS.
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of the primary interface to Flight Control is the dashboard for creating projects and environment services, managing them, monitoring them. Of course, we have the config as code and the GitHub integrations and all of that, but the dashboard is kind of your home.
Awesome. Well, Brandon, thanks so much for being here. I'm looking forward to seeing you in person next month.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
Cheers.
Cheers.